All right, guys. Hello. I don't typically do these things on Saturdays, especially Saturdays in the fall, because Saturdays in the fall I typically like to watch college football. And I am currently watching college football kind of in the background. Anybody who's curious, West Virginia, Texas right now, good game. Two good teams. Neither of them is probably going to make the Final Four of football, the national championship showdown. But they're both great teams, right? And if West Virginia wins the Big 12, they have an outside chance of winning it. So, great game. The other two games that were going on, Georgia, Kentucky, and Penn State and Michigan are duds. Georgia and Michigan won in convincing fashion. I say that as a Penn State fan, so not a good day for my Nittany Lions. But I'm also a Notre Dame fan. They're coming up later. But anyway, that aside, the people who are watching this aren't watching for my college football analytics or just being a fan. I want to talk about Prop 6, right? The election's on Tuesday. Prop 6 is one of the few propositions that affects me directly. And I think the best way to view this is as kind of the closing of a circle, right? So when we talk about when I talked about bonds, right, and our bond kind of payments, and the arguments that bond payments didn't lead to taxes, directly that's true, but I also said indirectly that's not true, right, because bond payments put a strain on the general fund and the budget that has to be made up through a variety of means. Either you can pay bonds off to pay off bonds, or more likely than not, the legislature is going to decide to start taxing people. Well, let's talk about Prop 6, right? So Prop 6 isn't a tax. Prop 6 is a tax repeal. It's important that people know that because the California Attorney General, and I say this, look, I'm a conservative Republican, okay? I guarantee you, look this up. Right, what the California Secretary of State did in describing Prop 6, it's not criminal, right? But it is downright unethical. It is downright unethical. If you look at Prop 6 on your ballot form, you'll see that it's described as eliminating transportation funding, right? And that's technically true. But what it really does is it eliminates the vehicle for that funding, which is a tax on us, the citizens. So a year ago, the legislature and Jerry Brown signed the Road Repair and Accountability Act that essentially added a 12-cent gas tax on top of an 18-cent gas tax that we already pay, right? And when you mix that in with the other taxes that we pay federally, essentially it raised California's taxes up to 56 cents per gallon. Right, so when you go and you see that gas is, $3.40? Subtract 56 cents, right, and that's how much gas would be without taxes. Subtract about half of that, and that's how much gas would be just under federal taxes and not California taxes. Subtract 12 cents per gallon off of that, and that's how much gas taxes would be without this new bill. And the tax added about $5 billion to the budget. That's what everyone's sort of arguing. That's the number, right? And that $5 billion, essentially most of that goes to road repair, road maintenance, right? Some of it goes to like road study and other kind of related expenditures, but most of it goes to road repair. So here's the deal. In 2010, Governor Schwarzenegger, you all remember Governor Schwarzenegger, don't you? Governor Schwarzenegger had to come up with a way to come up with a budget shortfall, or to resolve a budget shortfall. So these taxes go in what's called the California Transportation Fund, right? The Transportation Fund for years, up until around 2010 and thereafter, was essentially rated, and it was rated specifically to make bond payments off of the general obligation bonds that I told you about. Remember, California has about $179 billion in bonds, in general obligation bonds. That's not even counting the rest of it, right? They have to be paid off somehow. So what the legislature was doing was raiding the tax fund and saying, okay, we're going to use that tax fund and we're going to pay off our general obligation debts. And the reason they could do that is because the tax fund was a special fund, right? So the way California funds its government is they have one big, large general fund where most things go into, and then by legislative fiat, well, not by legislative fiat, but essentially by popular referenda, they create special funds. And I don't really want to get into the reason why, but the bottom line is they create special funds to compensate for the Constitution's limitations on how much the general fund expenditures can increase per year, right? So they essentially create these pocket funds. And if you spend and take away money from one of these little pocket funds, the general fund remains untouched, right? So what they were doing was they were siphoning off money from the railroad, from the gas tax, and using that money to pay back the bonds that we, the voters, had approved years and years before, right? Well, the California State Supreme Court, in a case called Shaw v. Chang, said, no, you can't do that, right? So the governor's workaround wasn't to stop doing that. The governor's workaround was to say, okay, we're going to take part of those taxes, we're going to suspend them, and we're going to replace them with a per gallon excise tax. So instead of like tax per gallon, essentially they're replacing it with a tax that's charged per the gallon that you pay, right? So they just reclassified the tax because there was essentially a loophole that said if you reclassified it as a per gallon excise tax as opposed to a total tax on all the gas that you pay, and you fix it that way, then you can still pay off the bonds. All of this is extremely confusing, right? This is a bunch of legislative chicanery, and I don't really hugely typically say that, but essentially it was a legislative way to keep doing what they were doing while at the same time complying with the law. So after 2010, they still rated the gas tax fund, they just rated it in a different way, right? They called it something a little bit different, but they still rated it. This comes at the expense of something, and obviously what does that come at the expense of? Take a look at our roads, guys. They're crumbling. The infrastructure is depleted. They're not good, right? You come across Stockton, not a mile from where I'm at, and the roads are crumbling. They haven't been worked on in years. And admittingly, that's not just California's fault. That's Stockton's fault too, right? This really more focuses on the highways, but a lot of them are in disrepair. I don't really think that's something I have to cite. I think we can all see that for ourselves. But this is the problem, guys. And before I launch into everything else, we have to understand this is the drawback, right? This is the closing of the loop that we start when we start sending bonds and creating general obligation bonds to fund things kind of noble or not at a whim, right? So we have to be very, very, very careful about what bonds we support. So when we're thinking about things like Prop 1, Prop 3, and Prop 4, we have to understand that there's a price. Prop 6 is the price, right? We pay that price. We pay that price when we go to the pump and we pay 12 cents a gallon extra now, right? Regardless of our income status. Okay, and that's the first argument in favor of Prop 6, that the tax that was imposed is what's effectively a regressive income tax, or a flat tax, either or, right? Essentially, let's put it this way. If you're rich, okay, and you pay a little bit extra for your gas, great. Okay, you can absorb that payment, right? But if you're poor, you're paying the same exact amount per gas as the wealthy are, but you don't have the same capacity to absorb that payment. That's what effectively a regressive tax is. It is a tax that unduly affects poor people. The tax the legislature passed in 2017 is undoubtedly that. Poor people, who more often exist in rural counties, need to drive, right? People generally need to drive, right? So driving is an integral part of the process, right? It is an inelastic good, right? Over short periods of time, right? Public transportation isn't as such that people can just stop driving unless you live in basically San Francisco, not even LA, right? So when you do something like that, okay, when those people are faced with that situation, right, you're essentially taxing them for living. It's a living tax. It's not a sin tax. It's not, this isn't a choice that they can make. You're taxing them for a basic expense that is needed to fund their lives, right? So when you do that, right, those are the people that hurt. And think about that. When people were thinking about bonds years and years and years and years ago, did they think that one day some poor schmo in some part of the state was going to effectively pay for that and be on the hook for that 10, 20 years later? No, they didn't think that. That's because nobody told them that. So we have to be very, 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 very careful when we make our funding decisions, when the legislature gives us that authority, right? And Prop 6 allows us to take some of that authority back, right? And admittingly, yes, look, I'm for Prop 6, okay? You can calculate that into, if you see this later and think, okay, well, this guy isn't giving a neutrally objective basis analysis, okay, but I still think my analysis stands, right? I think my analysis has a lot of weight to it, because I think it's true, right? This is the blowback. This is what happens when people start funding indiscriminately things without understanding the consequences. So Prop 6 proposes to let us overcome these consequences by basically repealing this thing that was passed last year, right? And if you repeal it, one, you're repealing a regressive tax, which means you're, by definition, helping the poor. You're allowing the poor to keep their own money, right? This is even better than getting someone else's money. This is allowing the working poor to keep their own money, the working middle class to keep their own money, and yes, the working wealthy, but as we discussed, they're not as affected by this as other people. Right? That's the first argument for it. Okay, that's a good argument. The second argument for it is obviously, that the legislature just kind of spend within their means. This argument's weaker, okay? And like I said, I like to give as much of a neutrally objective basis as I can while also being upfront with you about what my opinion is on this. The second argument given essentially is that California has $16 billion in a rainy day fund and they can just use that. They can take $5 billion of that and they can put it into road repair. The problem I have with that argument is that the rainy day fund exists for a reason, right? And Republicans are the ones that essentially are not only pushing for it, but pushing for Democrats to put more into it. California has a heavily income tax based model of government finance, which means if a recession hits, California is screwed, right? Just screwed, right? Because people make less money. They therefore give less money to the state of California, and therefore all of California's priorities wash away, right? It's why in 2000, it's why in 2008, we had these crises, right? It's why there was a budgetary crisis in 2010, right? The state didn't get out of it until recently, and that's when the economy started picking up, right? So when we do something like that, when we say, we're going to just tax heavily on income, right, we need to create a rainy day fund so that we can fund things at levels that we want to fund them at. So I don't think we should raid the rainy day fund either. Now, the second limitation of the argument is kind of the aftermath, right? So in summer, the voters passed Prop 69. I did a Facebook video on it, basically explaining the dimensions. I forgot I had done it until I just did research for Prop 6 and realized, oh yeah, this is a big thing. So Prop 69 stops the raiding, right? So the big worry is that if you spend more money for accountability, if you spend more money for highway repair or whatnot, that they're just going to keep raiding this and spend money on the general fund. The voters overwhelmingly, 81 to 18%, passed Proposition 69, which said, hey, look, we're not going to do that anymore, right? It's a constitutional amendment, a series of constitutional amendments, and I'll link them to you so you can take a look at it for yourself, but it's pretty clear that it prevents the legislature from raiding in the future. So every argument that I made, right, about things that had happened in the past and that's why we're here, I make those mainly as a historical observation to aid in our observation when we decide to pass bond funding, right? It cannot logically or ethically be an argument for Prop 6 because those funds, that rating can't continue anymore as of June 2018. Right, so you won't see that anymore. You may see it with other special funds, right? And I almost guarantee that you will, right? Because they have to pay back these bonds somehow. But you won't see it with this, right? You won't see it with the gas tax fund, at least not constitutionally, unless they find a way around it. And I'm sure somebody's going to try to find a way around it, but legally speaking, no, it can't happen anymore. And so the good news for us is that we don't have to worry about that. Now, the biggest drawback against Prop 6 is that if you do this, funds go away, right? I mean, obviously, that's the biggest drawback, right? And there's no point in denying that, right? And I mean, I guess, look, if people are still, after kind of seeing the results of their bond sort of, I don't want to say fetish, but the bond, method of funding things, still want to pass a bond to fund it, they still can, even though I would oppose that too, right? I think the legislature should find things to cut and live within their means, right? That's what I think they should do. But again, I mean, obviously it takes away that funding. And I think the last argument I would leave in favor of Prop 6 is that Prop 6, the transportation fund, not only works for road repair, but it also works for mass transit, right? This is a big bugaboo that I have with this, right? This is a big problem I have with this. Prop 6, right, funding public transportation would make, the Road Repair and Accountability Act funding public transportation would only make more sense if public transportation was actually taxed, right? Vehicles are taxed, gas is taxed, right? But public transportation is not taxed. And yet some of those funds will go to public transportation, which means we in the rural areas, we in the suburban areas are subsidizing stuff that we don't use. I don't know the last time, 2004, 2003 was the last time I took a bus in Stockton. I mean, I have used the ACE train, admittingly, although I had to pay an arm and a leg for it. But, you know, I don't typically use public transportation. It doesn't really help me out, right? A car helps me out, but public transportation doesn't. So, when we say something like, oh, hey, look, we've got to do something about public transportation, fine. Perhaps we should find a more adequate source of funding that doesn't siphon it from rural farm communities or suburban communities and siphons it to this. Yes, a lot of that funding is going to go to repair the roads, but it's also going to go to do things like mass transit that we don't support. And I would note, as a rebuttal, well, as kind of a compliment to the Prop 6, we're going to lose funding argument, that the backers of Prop 6 are already trying to put it on the 2020 ballot, and they'll probably succeed since they were able to put Prop 6 on the ballot, a measure that would divert funding from the for the high-speed rail and divert it to road repair. And I think that's a wise thing, because I think people are souring on high-speed rail. So if you're going to divert it, maybe divert it from something that's a little bit more pie in the sky and something that's less concrete, because people aren't affected by it yet, like high-speed rail, and not, you know, some other funding source. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this was coherent and clear. The sum total of this is we need to be very, very careful about our bond purchases and our bond expenditures. And we need to, and this is why, because now we're in a situation where we're being taxed for something we didn't want to be taxed. We should repeal this tax, right? Because it's an unfair tax. It absolutely is an unfair tax on us. Because not only is it a tax that a lot of people who didn't vote for bonds are now paying to fund these bonds, like, let's say, myself and other people I know, but it's also a tax that funds things that the people who are being taxed aren't funding, right? People who drive on roads are being asked to fund public transportation and BART and mass transit. That's not something they should have to fund, right? That's something that should come from a more localized source of support. But on the other hand, yes, doing that will remove a source of funding, and while the backers of Prop 6 have kind of proposed to divert high-speed rail to that funding, that's going to take a couple of years, so there's going to be a bit of a drawback. Maybe the legislature can come from somewhere else in the middle, in the duration. That's their call, right? That is a drawback, so when you're looking at Prop 6, just understand two basic things. Okay, even if you decide to vote against Prop 6, just be more careful about when we decide to vote yes on bonds, right? Because this is the drawback. This is the drawback, right? If you don't want taxes coming up on you in the future, don't support bonds. Anyway, thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it. Have a nice one, and enjoy some football, guys. Peace out.